Let's cut the bullshit.
Just drop the job.
Adam and Simon's Bullshit Busters.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of Adam and Simon Bullshit Busters with me, Simon Batchelor.
Me, Adam Bastock.
And this week we are tackling another mega topic, which is transport. So, in every business, there are elements of transportation, and we're going to dive into a few of the kind of bigger, I guess, headings of the topic of transport to kind of show you a little bit of how this applies across different areas of your business. And obviously, some of these are going to apply more to some businesses than others. But essentially, when we think about transport, Adam, do you want to start us off by talking about some of the main areas that we kind of consider when we're thinking about sustainability journey and transport?
Yeah, perfect. Because I think there's a few key figures around transport we want to get into in the fact that it accounts for roughly a third of the UK's domestic emissions. So transport is, by the very nature of it, going to be a really big part of your carbon footprint. Now, you might immediately think, but Adam, I don't drive a car, I don't drive a vans, I don't do anything. It's like, correct. However, you are probably getting things delivered to you at some point, and therefore there are it's so multifaceted in terms of moving things and people around that it gets very overwhelming. So as soon as you look at something like a carbon footprint report and technically doing this, there's several places that transport fits into this. Is one, scope 1 emissions. Any vehicles that you own is part that the company operates or owns is part of scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 doesn't really occur in there. Scope 3, there's then multiple categories where it appears. So you've got business travel, you've got commuting, you've got visitor travel, so people visiting your site, you've got freight logistics, and you've got employee commuting and people coming to your office, as well as business travel. So I think I've probably duplicated some of those, but you immediately realise that actually everything you're doing, so me getting the train down to London for a meeting, that is my business travel. Staff going from the south side of Glasgow by train into the office, that's commuting travel. Me ordering new pens for the office, new whiteboard pens, whatever it might be, that suddenly becomes part of my logistics as well. So transport is kind of omnipresent and really big, and that's why it can feel quite overwhelming. But I think the good news is it's not really a technology problem. It is far more a behavior change problem, and I think that's the thing we need to do is just, and well, that goes for all of net zero really, in my opinion, is a lot of this is behavior change, not shiny new objects. But the only thing you can't decarbonize through transport is basically flights. That is the only thing you really need to try and reduce and shift behaviors away from, and that is typically, well, rather than flying from London to Glasgow, get the train, because it will be far lower. And not to wrap open another buzzword bingo, so those of you listening at home, please do get your cards and stamp it off. We should probably start selling these. It is like a carbon budget, essentially, of going, well, actually, if you take 1 ton of emissions, and which, that it's such a weird amount, a ton, it's very hard to visualize, but you can quite easily understand how many flights that buys you and how many train rides that flight gets you between London and Glasgow. And so even within like business travel, suddenly having a carbon budget is a really useful way of digesting what your transport is.
I think that's a really interesting introduction because for a lot of people, they don't necessarily consider that there are elements of travel that impact their business that are actually sort of, if not directly caused by, but are part of their day to day. So when most people think about transport, they think of, well, how do me and my team get to work? And they might think about, well, if I send out a lot of parcels, if I'm an e-commerce business, for example, I send out lots of parcels. So therefore, that's having some emissions impact. So, for example, we're a digital marketing company. So for us, when we did our carbon footprint, we found that actually one of the largest parts of our transport emissions were people coming to see us. And that is something that we hadn't even considered. It's like, well, this is people coming to see, driving their cars to our meetings. So what we decided to do as part of a sort of overall strategy was to actually switch our business vehicles to electric vehicles. And now we go and see our clients. So we've switched that mileage out to be electric car miles. And we've also reduced the number of miles that our clients have to do in their, we would have any control over what car they come in. So that was one switch we made. But on the face of it, it wouldn't have been something I would have even considered doing or considered even looking at until we did that carbon footprint measurement.
I think that's the key thing, and it's even small decisions. So one is like, well, actually, if we are hosting an event in Edinburgh and asking people to come and visit us, how are we timing that? Are the timings allowing people to get the train up, where it maybe starts a little bit later in the morning rather than it starting bang on 9 a.m., where people then might just go, well, I'll fly up and then get come straight from the flight, because that's how the timetables work. Or a big thing that we see is, or like myself have seen, is frustration with venues. With if you're running a sustainability conference or a sustainability event, please don't put it in a sports park in the middle of nowhere, because that means that everyone's driving to it, and that means that I have to get like 3 buses and a train to kind of get there. Whereas if it's in the centre of town, in an office space, everyone's going to get the train in, and suddenly that starts reducing. And I think there's a really interesting, I think it was Sky Sports, someone I met ages ago at an event, and we just got chatting about this, is they realised that part of their footprint, 80% of it was fans attending events. Because if you think of something like a football stadium, okay, most of those you can get to via public transport, but if people are suddenly driving to that, that is several thousand people moving around that just for one event that might be somewhat unnecessary in terms of that critical infrastructure. And so if you could turn those cars into trains, it suddenly becomes a lot lower carbon. And I think this is where
Yeah.
transport is really exciting, because you can see the rapid decarbonisation. And if you've got someone driving a Range Rover into work every day and put them into a small petrol car, that is still about a 40% reduction in emissions. If you get them out of that onto something like an e-bike, which is unlikely but possible, that is then like a 99% reduction in emissions. So this idea of net zero being possible around 90% reductions, it is achievable through behavior shifts and through infrastructure that we have already now. We just need to build it.
Yes, and I think just thinking about the e-bikes thing there, the cycle to work scheme is often presented as a really complicated thing that you need to use an agent to do. But actually, you can literally buy any bike from any supplier. You just walk into a bike shop and buy the bike, and then through your
Yeah.
accounts, you can claim it back through the scheme. You fill in one form. So, as a small business, we didn't realize we could do this. We thought we had to go through some kind of Evans voucher scheme thing, and it was all complicated and blah blah blah. Actually, for small business, it's really really simple. So, and e-bikes are covered. There isn't really an upper limit on small businesses as to what bikes you can buy. Obviously, there are considerations in terms of how long it's going to take someone to pay that back and blah blah blah. But the VAT benefit just on bikes alone is 20%. You get straight back in your VAT balance of that quarter. I mean, if you're, helping your team switch over to e-bikes by helping them make that more affordable, by making that payment last longer. No, sorry. You can spread that payment over in more manageable small payments. You can make that switch much more attractive for your team. And actually, it's really simple to do as a small business.
And I think there's also really fun things you can start doing, where I've seen some companies offer the kind of, what's the word, mileage payments on bicycles. So
Oh,
they kind
yes.
of they actually go, well, we will pay you the same amount as if you were driving, and just pay you 45p a mile for getting to a meeting if you're cycling rather than driving. And that suddenly has that incentive and behavior change impacts of going, well, sure, that means I'm saving on fuel, but I'm still getting paid to do it, and then the company's lowering their carbon footprint. So again, it's finding that behavior change and fun and exciting ways to do that, rather than it just being purely let's spend 50 grand on a new electric car. That sometimes will be the answer. Not always doesn't have to be the answer. And I think that's the challenge that I have with transport when speaking to small businesses, especially, is that people focus on the solution and the technology, not on the behavior. And it's actually, well, if you are only doing 10 miles a week, you probably don't need to buy a car. You probably don't need to use a car or own a car. You might have a car club where you then drive that, once every 2 weeks. That car club car is then going to take 18 private vehicles off the road locally, because there are 18 other people in an urban area who are doing the same thing, where they've got a car and they're only using it once a week to drive a few miles. So again, it's just thinking about identifying how your how you're moving about and what your actual behavior and patterns look like before you start buying or investing in technology, because often it is that's the mind shift moment that happens, is people go, oh yeah, I didn't actually realize that 80% of the journeys we're doing are less than a mile. And that goes for even someone like a building merchant or not
Yeah.
like a building company. You might immediately think, well, of course you can't do that by electric cargo bike because it's a buildings merchant. They're going to be moving big, heavy things around all the time in vans. The question is, well, actually, are they? Let's quantify that. How many miles are you doing that are less than 1 mile? How many miles are you doing that are or how many journeys are you doing that's 1 to 5? How do we start maybe using electric vans for those short-term ranges, and then use the bigger diesel vans for longer ranges? And that's just an operational efficiency around the resource that you're using, because carbon is a resource, and therefore the more effectively you can use it, the more money you're going to save through things like fuel costs and taxes. So there is this understanding of what the impacts there are.
Yeah, and I think it's also, as we have said quite a few times on the podcast, it's an opportunity to look at your business processes and to think, okay, this is how we're currently doing it. We're currently putting this in that van and sending it off there, and then you know this person's driving it around town and blah blah blah. They're doing whatever they're doing, but there's also a real opportunity there to say, well, is this the best way to be doing this? Could we be doing this more efficiently, or could we just stop doing that and either subcontract it out to another provider who already has all the infrastructure? So in Brighton, there's a company called Zendify who have little electric delivery bikes and little delivery, almost like micro vans, but they're pedal powered vans. So they don't get stuck in traffic because they can whiz along the cycle lanes. They can, go through the traffic. Brilliant. And their last mile delivery cost is going to be so much cheaper than potentially than you buying your own van and trying to operate it yourself. And actually you start to think, well, you don't necessarily have to buy and own that whole process. There could be someone you could collaborate with. And it might also be that you're driving the same way as someone else that is going. And actually, they're already driving a truck there. So actually, if you get on their truck, you lighten their load, lower their cost, and even if that is a diesel powered truck and it's going all the way from Leeds to London, at least you're sharing the emissions there and you're reducing that. So I think it's really important, as you just said, to remember that the solution to reducing your carbon emissions and becoming a more sustainably minded business isn't necessarily directly, I need to buy this new thing to make it all work. There isn't always a technological solution to a process problem.
And I think there's also the co-benefits as well, because if you look at something like the electric cargo bikes you mentioned, one of the main benefits there is then anyone can use them, and they don't need to get a license. So if you've got a workforce where only 2 people out of 20 have got van licenses, well, suddenly you're increasing your potential delivery driver pool by tenfold, or somewhat. Not everyone's going to drive them necessarily, but it suddenly means that you've got a much more resilient workforce as well. That and you can hire in new labour much more effectively in that sense. And I think that's on that logistics point. Return logistics is something the big supermarkets have been doing for decades. And if you look at someone like Aldi or Lidl, the reason why they're so low margin in terms of the way that they can deliver such low costs is because they've invested in the infrastructure internally to be able to do that. So I used to work for a company that made and sold like industrial shelving units, and that included things like boxes and like the trays that you'd get, that products would come into a supermarket and then they'd take them out of the thing, put them on the shelf, and then put them back in the van and take it away. They designed new collapsible containers that saved about 80% of the space. That doesn't sound like much on one, but if you imagine like a big, 600 mil by, I don't know, like kind of a meter wide box that then is 300 mil high. If you could take that from 300 mil high when it's assembled down to 50 mil or something when it's collapsed, that's an extra 250 mil per box that you can actually stack onto a lorry. And as soon as you start doing the volumes on that, you're actually saving thousands and millions of pounds a year probably on fuel costs by reducing those return logistics down. So this is something that people who have been working in warehousing and logistics chains know very well, and they have the skills and the knowledge here to adapt it. I think the issue is that isn't being converted into everyday small businesses who may not kind of realize this and understand it and see the benefits to their business in an efficiency point of view, and are thinking it purely as a technology problem of I need an electric van to reduce my emissions, not I need better boxes.
Yeah. I mean, a story I heard a very long time ago is, do you know Rachel's Yogurt, who are now owned by some mega dairy, but it started off on a lady called Rachel's Farm, and she lives at the end of a very long road in Wales. So she started making this amazing yogurt, and she was thinking, well, I'm making this amazing product, but I live in the middle of nowhere. How on earth am I going to get my product out there? And she realized that there was a lorry that drove into her village to restock the co-op that was in her village, and then went back empty, just full of crates, as you've just described. So she called the company that had the sticker on the front of the lorry and said, I need to take stuff to where you're going, and you're driving an empty truck. Now, of course, as a logistics manager, they are optimizing the entire route, and they jumped at the chance to have someone load something onto the lorry. So even though it extended the driver's journey very slightly to go to the farm and get loaded up with a pallet of yogurt, it actually meant that she could then reach central distribution, because this lorry goes back to centralized supermarket distribution. And then, of course, she had the logistics manager saying, I've got a lorry load of yogurt here. Have we got anywhere we can sell it? Oh, yeah, turns out the co-op. So they then had this amazing thing. So even if you're a small business, don't be put off by the fact that there could be a big business out there that is actually might be willing to help, purely because it's helping them to be more efficient and to save money and to do all this stuff. So it's always worth reaching out, particularly in the logistics field, I think.
And I think bringing this back to net zero or carbon reduction, this is a marginal gain. You know, this is a case of if you can reduce everything you're doing by 10%, that will probably have a compound effect on your emissions that is much bigger than that. So don't underestimate the power of these small actions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we could probably sit here for the rest of the day and talk about transport and give more examples, but we're going to have to call it a day on this podcast episode for now. But if you've got a question about transport or logistics or something about the travel-related emissions in your business, then do leave us a comment underneath this video or get in touch with either me or Adam, and we will try and make an episode that answers that question and helps other people understand more about the topic as well. So there's lots of different ways that you can find out about reducing your carbon emissions, as well as making a net zero plan on the Small 99 website. There's loads of different bits of information there, and workshops and events you can turn up to. It's all happening. So do check out the Small 99 website. And until next time, thanks very much for listening and watching. Bye.
And we'll see you soon. Bye.
Let's cut the bullshit.
Just drop the job.
Adam and Simon's Bullshit Busters.